Okay, so we really enjoyed your presentation. There were a bunch of really interesting takes and ideas on how today's marketing of games of various IP looks like.
Yeah.
So we had a few questions and wanted to ask you. So, for example, how in different countries around the world marketing strategies of gaming IPs differ and why, in your opinion?
Oh, that's a big question.
Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, what I talked about was mainly IPs and brand building.
Yeah.
I think some countries have a stronger storytelling tradition than other countries. And some countries have a stronger engineering tradition than other countries. And we do see a lot of those splits. So the countries with very strong engineering traditions are often very good at, game technology and gameplay and things like that. And then some of them have a little bit of a tendency to copy the character designs and the stories from American movies, for example.
Yeah.
And then other countries are really strong in the storytelling, but they're not so strong in technology. So they will make something really original, but it won't get a very big audience. So, you see some countries where it's very much art, and then it's not very commercial. So I don't want to name countries, but it does, there are, it's almost as if each country has its own personality.
Okay.
And if you close your eyes, you pretty much know what they are, right?
Yeah. Okay. So, how does gaming IPs, different gaming IPs, evolve during the decades, and should it adapt or should it just stay the same, more or less?
Well, I think that definitely happens. If you look at Lara Croft, for example, she has developed a great deal. In the beginning, she had enormous breasts, and you can't do that today because it would be sexist, right? So she has evolved like that, but she's also evolved to have much more. She's much more emotional now because you can actually render that emotions now. Back when you only had 10 polygons, it was difficult to do complicated emotions.
Yeah.
But the same happens in the movies, right? Where if you look at James Bond, he has really changed every decade, has its own James Bond, right? So Sean Connery was one kind of James Bond, and Roger Moore was another. And when Daniel Craig came in, suddenly he was much more like Bourne, He had this sort of brutal, raw aesthetic. It'll be very interesting to see what the next James Bond is like. Is he going to be a computer hacker or what? Because
Or a woman.
Or a woman.
Yeah.
Or an African American, or
But still, James Bond actually has their own tropes and cliches they like to keep like cars, like martinis, like everything. They kind of do not change that. It's like.
But that's the IP, right?
Yeah.
I think, even if they do a reboot of Harry Potter and they start the whole film series again, it's still going to be about a wizard who goes to school.
Yeah.
It's not going to be Harry Potter goes to the moon.
Yeah.
Because then it's not the same thing anymore. And that was a big part of my talk, is that IPs are very much about buying the same emotion again.
Yeah.
So every time you're buying this Harry Potter, you're buying a story about bullying and going to school and magic. So if you change the central things, then you lose people.
Okay.
So with James Bond, for example, I think he's always going to be the tuxedo and the agent and, stylish and things like that. And there's always going to be the evil organizations and the British sort of thing. You can't suddenly make him, something else.
Okay.
We're never going to see James Bond the electrician, because then it's not that IP anymore.
Okay. And kind of vice versa. For example, Gears of War, it has a very mechanic and gameplay that everyone knows, and they can a little change the plot, the lead characters, and still have this gameplay core mechanics, and it still attracts people because it changed very much in the talking about the plot
and they're not bodybuilders anymore, right?
Yeah.
They're becoming smaller. There's coming women into the
emotions and more on that
exactly.
Okay.
The IPs can definitely evolve, but if you change them too much, then people don't recognize them. So it's a balance, right? Because people are clicking on the same thing again.
Yeah, and you mentioned Lara Croft, and I think now that if we removed the tombs, that wouldn't be Tomb Raider anymore. So
right.
They had to keep something in for that.
Think of Indiana Jones, right? I mean, there has to be. You have to identify what is the core elements of the IP, and you can't lose those. But you can argue about what they are. It's sometimes difficult.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another maybe a little bit trickier question. What gaming IPs should look like when the gaming genres are changing, and there are some, for example, now there are very big focus on battle royale games and everything. So how should gaming IPs react to that, especially when they're?
I think it's very difficult to talk about there being one way to do these things. There's no magic bullet. When you're building an IP, you need to have something unique, and you can't say do this to have something unique, because then it would not be unique anymore.
Yes.
So both with building an IP and building a brand, it's about finding out what's unique in this game, and then making it, amplifying it so a bigger audience can think it's cool. So that's why the artists are important, because it's the people making that original emotional artistic intent. That's the core of it. And that's, I think, a lot of game developers go wrong in that, and that they think the game is only the mechanics and the technology.
Yeah.
But the design of the characters and the story is an enormous part of what people are buying, and also what the investors are investing in.
Okay. And speaking about the techniques of a game, for example, there's a trend now also that big IP is coming out, for example, Star Wars, the Fallen Order. And they couldn't resist the temptation to add something that is very popular now, like Dark Souls mechanics. So because it's popular, it's trendy, and they're using that in a way, I guess. But how should they do that? Like, should they put it in their marketing strategies, like advertise it that they have this mechanics, or better not talk about it? And is there some risks in that?
Well, there's always risk. I think it's about identifying what the core IP is, and that's different from franchise to franchise. If you look at Star Wars, then the IP is not the gameplay. The IP is the universe and the Force and the lightsabers and Darth Vader and all those things. So in principle, you can put any gameplay on that. Of course, there are some expectations because of earlier Star Wars games, but I don't think the gameplay is a central part of the Star Wars IP. You can have a Star Wars strategy game. You can have a Star Wars Dark Souls game. You can have TIE Fighter. So for that one, I would say the gameplay is not. But if you take Gears of War, I don't think anybody wants a strategy Gear of War game.
Yeah.
Right? The sort of cover shooter mechanic is a central part of that IP. But it's not a central part of the Star Wars IP. So it's different from game to game.
Okay, that's...
I don't think you can do a Lara Croft Dark Souls game, because there's a certain expectation of a certain gameplay in these. Although, they're getting there.
Yeah.
So, nothing is set in stone. It's about, I think the user's expectations are elastic, but if you break them, they get really angry. So you can stretch them, but you better be careful about how much you can stretch. And that's why you need to, if you have an audience already, you need to test with that audience to make sure that it's living up to their expectations.
But also looking from another angle, when Gears of War came out, a lot of games copied it in one way or another, like cover shooting mechanics and everything like that. So maybe they are trying to broaden their own audiences. Like, we have an IP, it's getting bigger, and they're using this very well-known mechanic. They try to broaden their own game. Yeah. But there's also a risk in that.
But there's a risk, and the big companies are able to test these things, right? I'm pretty sure that Overwatch 2 was tested for 1 billion hours before it was released, right?
Yes.
Is this, and then they would focus group and ask people, is this living up to your expectations? Would you recommend it to your friends? All these things.
Okay.
That's more difficult to do if you have a smaller budget. But if you're a smaller company, maybe your fans have not got these expectations yet.
Okay.
So.
And what do you think about, for example, studios and people nowadays who are in the advertising, all the process, they use themselves, like Tim Schafer, who just comes out, says, well, you see the guy and the story behind him, but not the actual game, like less of a game, more of a Tim Schafer, for example.
Right.
And he's like using himself in the advertisement all the time.
He's the IP. It's the same with, Flambeer, for example.
Yeah.
Rami Ismail is the IP, but you have to be a rock star to do that. And I don't know if you noticed, but there are not very many programmers or game designers who are rock stars.
Yeah.
In the film business where everything is about performance and looking cool and so on, there's a lot of rock stars. In the music business, there's a lot of rock stars. In game, not so many. The people who want to make games did not do it to look cool. They did it because they enjoyed working with games. So if you have it like Rami does or Tim Schafer, great. And you can actually bring your audience to a new kind of game because the IP is you. But you have to be able to build that following, and that's not easy.
Okay, but Hideo Kojima is like kind of similar here.
Definitely. Hideo Kojima is like a famous movie director, right? But there's actually not many movie directors who are IPs. There's pretty much only Steven Spielberg. Everybody knows Steven Spielberg. You will go and see the next Steven Spielberg movie. But only the nerds will go and see the new David Fincher movie, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what they go and see is, let's go watch Lord of the Rings. And it's the same, that's actually a mistake that a lot of game studios make, is that the studio is not an IP most of the time. Nobody goes and watches the next Take-Two game or play the next Take-Two game. No, they're going and play Grand Theft Auto.
Yeah.
That's the IP. Just like nobody goes and watches the next Warner Brothers movie. It doesn't work like that. They go and watch Joker.
Yeah.
He's the IP. But if you are a star, and if you can get, 1 million followers on Twitter, then you're an IP.
Okay.
Donald Trump is a pretty strong IP.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
No doubt.
And he's performing every day, all the time, right? He's fan service, he's really good at it. He's not so good at being a president, though.
Yeah. Okay. So probably the last question, not to keep you any longer. How gaming marketing strategies differ from other industries? For example, movies, or even cars industry. What are the differences, and maybe what are the similarities in there?
Well, I think they're actually converging, because what's been happening the last 10 years is that franchises have taken over the movie industry.
Yeah.
10 to 20 years ago, that was not the case. 10 to 20 years ago, you went to a movie to see the new Matt Damon movie, or to see the latest Clint Eastwood movie.
Yeah.
And because they were the IPs. But today it's Marvel and, DC Universe and so on, and that's part of globalization. So the stars have actually become a lot less important in movies, and in that way, they're actually a lot like games now. So you'll go and watch the new Captain America movie.
Yeah.
And you'll also go and play the new Lara Croft game. So actually movies have become more and more like games, I think. And in some ways, of course, games have become better at telling stories, so they've become a little bit more like movies. I think they're getting pretty close to each other like that. But the fan culture is much stronger with games, The whole online interaction, I think, is... Games can take that to a whole other level. But that's both positive and negative, right?
But there's a good example talking about the fans, like for me personally, Shenmue game, the third one is coming out now. Shenmue, I don't know.
No, I don't know.
It's a Japanese game about a guy who just, I don't know, maybe I did not pronounce it the correct way, but it's the game that was dropped in 2001. There was two
Shenmue?
Parts. Yeah, Shenmue.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know if I pronounced it right either. Yeah.
Because in Lithuania we just pronounce it like that, but it probably. But it's a good example of that, like what fans can do, because fans generate.
It was kickstarted, right?
Yeah, kickstarted, and if it did not generate 7 million or something like that, Sony would never greenlit the development of that or help them. So that's
I think game fans, or with games, there's really the opportunity to build an enormous community. Yeah. If you look at, my favorite games are games like Dark Souls and Bloodborne, where half the fun is going to the wiki and figuring out how the hell do I kill this thing. And being part of that whole conversation is enjoyable. My children don't play single-player games. I play single-player games. That's for dad.
Yeah.
But the new generation, playing games is something you do with your friends. So it's all about the community, right? It's all about having Discord running and building teams and going in together and evaluating what happened and so on. So I think that's only going to get stronger and stronger. But the movies are never going to work like that. We can have a talk about the Joker, but it's just not the same level of engagement. And it's only 2 hours.
Yeah.
So for me, I mean, games are definitely the medium of the future, as well as the medium now.
And like new Terminator, it came out and it didn't generate enough money, so fans are like, what can we do now? Because they just won't make a sequel, perhaps. Probably.
That was a pity. But it's been dead for years, if you ask me.
Yeah.
I mean, but I want to see it when it comes, but we'll see.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you
for coming, and thank you for giving your time.
I enjoyed that. Thank you very much.
Okay.